welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today in the show, we have Rigo Martinez. He's an otolaryngologist and he's a healthcare executive. He wrote the Kevin MD article, "Here's a Crazy Thought: Make technology work for doctors." Rodrigo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thrilled to be here.
We'll get to the article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, I think many of us who have found careers adjacent to traditional clinical medicine, it's been one of a lot of introspection and observation, as well as kind of ultimately yielding to our inner curiosity. So I went about chasing a dream to become an otolaryngologist, and then I wanted to be a facial plastic surgeon, and did that for a few years. But along the way, I was discovering how cool technology was, first as a resident, when suddenly I didn't have to go in to read all the x-rays. It was so convenient to do stuff from home and to be able to guide some of the junior residents from home and make calls without having to go in to see films. And then, the organization, so the health system there, Stony Brook, started to move towards Cerner, and I got interested in that. And then I focused on what I wanted to do clinically, went down that path. But after a few years, really was thinking, I miss kind of those real big macro level challenges. I think in medicine, we are trained to typically treat one patient at a time. And I really missed the kind of thinking that's involved in solving kind of really big picture challenges. And I decided that I wanted to do more of that. And I made a very abrupt career change and decided to jump into consulting. I remember in the mid-2000s using LinkedIn for the first time as a way of kind of reaching out to people. Around then, there weren't a lot of people who had left full-time practice. And so a lot of it was just trying to network and find out people who'd done it. But ultimately, I made my way initially to McKesson. And then I was recruited to move to DC in 2010. And I joined a company called Clinivations, which really was focusing on incorporating physicians in particular in the important conversations that needed to happen prior to and during EHR implementations. We did a lot of work there, everything from system selection all the way through to go live support optimization thereafter. So I got a lot of exposure to a lot of different types of projects, especially ones geared around process improvement at the intersection of clinical workflows and electronic health records. Rode that wave for a while. We were acquired in 2015 by the advisory board, and then advisory board was in turn acquired by Optum 2018. I left Optum shortly thereafter, joined a startup based out of Seattle called Transformative Med. The co-founder there had created M pages inside of Cerner, and they had a great business creating very physician-specific and specialty-specific views inside of Cerner. And then I was invited to come join PerfectServe 10 months ago. I joined and have entered the world of digital healthcare communications, stepping away from the EHR and looking a lot more at a broader definition of the care team, now inclusive of the patient and the family. So it's, for me, a very educational journey along the way, but I've loved being able to look at, the future and what's coming next and helping organizations prepare for that. So a lot of fun.
So making that transition from otolaryngology to all the roles that you do in a non-clinical setting, has it been what you expected?
So I think that it has been, I understood that in making that transition, I was going to have to make a choice. I think a critical moment for me was the CEO of Clinivations at the time, a guy named Trenner Williams. He had made a similar decision. He had worked at Deloitte Consulting, and he sat me down one day and said, "Rodrigo, as you make this transition, I'm going to provide you a choice of two paths. Number one, you could go and become a subject matter expert. You will top out very quickly.
Mhm.
He said, or I can teach you how to do traditional consulting, but you're going to have to start at the bottom. And it may open up many more doors. It's going to be much more difficult. And so, being a glutton for punishment and a bit of a masochist, I said, yeah, sure, why not? I'll
Mhm.
start all over again. But it was, for me, a huge eye opener. There were a lot of things that I had wanted to learn and understand. I had been toying, like, should I go to business school? Is that what one does? But I found that by kind of engaging in a lot of these projects and paying a lot of attention to the way my colleagues worked, particularly those who were much younger than me, who had been in traditional consulting roles, and understanding how they tackled problems, how they organized themselves, how they organized for meetings, how they created PowerPoints. Just constantly noticing how different everything was and opening myself up to be willing to learn
Mhm.
and to move away from expecting to be the smartest person in the room. And I think that was, for me, one of the most difficult things, is that in medicine, you rarely jump into something blind, and you rarely feel comfortable going in and winging it.
Mhm.
And we are kind of trained to understand everything, anticipate every potential problem, and it is a very different mindset in the consulting world, and it's a much more collaborative approach to doing things. And a lot of that appealed to me, and I think I've been thrilled the way it's turned out, the people I've met, and the types of things that I've learned. So I think in those regards, it's actually really exceeded my expectations. So yeah.
All right. Let's talk about the Kevin MD article that you wrote. It's titled,
Yeah.
Here's a Crazy Thought. Make technology work for doctors. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Sure. So I think that the initial draw to the world of electronic health records was the fact that physicians didn't seem to be part of the conversation. That was the first thing. I just, as I entered the process and was exposed to the process as a resident, it just seemed that administrators were making decisions, IT was making decisions, and then things were just being delivered. And I felt that I anticipated that that was going to be a recipe for disaster. And I was just drawn to wanting to step in there. And so, in the article, I think it really, I was drawing upon lessons that I've learned, not only as someone who was involved in the strategic thinking that happened before implementations, but actually somebody who really focused on the importance of engaging physicians ahead of time. And so really just kind of talk about a little bit of the history of the EHRs, implementations, and the amount of money that has been spent, and how, still to this day, when you look and think about topics like burnout, the EHR is still playing a huge role in that. I think it very often is, the concept of EHR is still, at least for the generation of folks who went through the transition, it's a dirty word. It still conjures, I think a lot of people have PTSD from that transition, and something that I think some of the younger members of our audience may not actually appreciate. But I think any kind of huge transition like that can be potentially traumatic. And so just was thinking of, okay, what are some basic pointers that I can provide to people so that they don't have to feel that everything's just being done to them, but that they can actually get involved. So
now I want to go into those pointers and tips, but just I want to ask you, because you've been on the kind of the industry side of this.
Yeah.
What's the reason that they don't include more practicing physicians into that technology adoption process, whether it's EHR or another product?
I think one of the main things that's tricky in medicine is that the end users are very often not the buyers. And I think that that's important and very different than a lot of than our experience in the consumer world, right? Those companies, places like Apple, the people who make all of the applications that, we are so used to in the commercial world, those are being sold to us or given away for free to us. And this is something that's very, very different when you're implementing something like an EHR or communication systems. There's a hope that you are introducing these into standardized processes and workflows, but because we are still in a state of transition, that is not necessarily the case. Maybe organizations have been able to require the use of the electronic health record, but there's still a ton of variability, not only in workflows, but also in expectations that have been set by the people who are ultimately buying this. And I think that there's a huge underinvestment in making sure that the workflows work. They just buy, oftentimes they're buying it, they are implementing it, and people just expect that it's going to be, so intuitive and useful that people will just figure it out. But I think a lot of people just continue to struggle, and they often don't know what help is available or if there's even any help available.
So let's talk about some of those tips that you mentioned to help ease and facilitate the transition of technology adoption into clinical staff. So what are some of those tips?
Yeah, I think, so let's say you're a brand new doc to a brand new organization. I think one of the most fundamental things that you should do, and so on one extreme, let's say I am not interested in knowing about computers, nor am I interested in getting involved. I'd say to that person, at the very least, find out who the resource, or what resources are available to you to make sure that number one, what software is available, and number two, how can you use it to its maximum. Focus on your workflow, because at the end of the day, that's going to be what's going to make or break you. The more complex and irritating it becomes, the sooner you're going to just kind of fry yourself. But I think at the very basic, just understand, is there some kind of a physician liaison or somebody from an informatics team that can help? And then you can also talk to your partners and any colleagues that you have working there. These can be other physicians, it can be nurses, other people who have had experience with that application or those applications, and get some tips and tricks, from them. Many times there's the ability to share templates, to share documentation practices and order sets. Make your life easy. Don't try to have to, reinvent the wheel or start absolutely from scratch. A lot of these EHRs, when used well and designed and configured well, can really, really speed up a lot of your day. And so just because you open up the screen and you don't recognize anything, doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. And I think investing a little bit of time up front is going to save you a ton of time in the end. So that's what I would say. That's one of the things I talk about there in the article, at least for people who just want to make the minimum investment. On the big side, there are some people who are fascinated and love the technology. And I would say, find out if there's an informatics division or a group within the organization. If you have a CMIO or you have a CIO, understand them, get to know them. You will start to have insight into what's around the corner. What are some of the big picture strategies? I think it can be tricky understanding that as we have moved to a much more patient-centric approach to care delivery, suddenly a lot of the decisions that we may think are convenient for us or we want to make for just ourselves, our group, or our specialties can have downstream consequences that we may not think about. So I think understanding the big picture can be very, very valuable. So
we're talking to Rigo Martinez. He's an otolaryngologist and healthcare executive. He wrote the Kevin MD article. Here's a crazy thought: make technology work for doctors. Rigo, I think that clinicians complaining about electronic health records and new technology, this has been going on for years now. And I think there's always going to be a little bit of a gap between what clinicians expect from the proverbial front lines of medicine and what they're getting. But over your years in this industry, are you seeing that gap narrow between practicing clinicians and what they're getting from industry?
Yes, I think it's narrowing. I think people are listening. I do think that there is a certain amount that technology can do, but there's a huge part that has to do with human behavior, right? The whole change management component of it. Some organizations, manage it better than others. And there's a lot that you end up having to just understand what what is truly a technical problem, what is actually just a policy that's suddenly being enforced that wasn't enforced before, and the EHRs just suddenly make it very easy to enforce. And other things are, I may just be using a different workflow that worked well in one environment and is not going to work here. So I think it's opening yourself up to understanding what's going on and what the ultimate intentions are can be valuable. You're not always going to agree with it, but I think that technology is improving. One of the things that I think maybe hinder how quickly the changes happen are the fact that there's always a shiny new ball. So if we think about a lot of electronic health record implementations really focused initially on physician order entry, and then they started to move to documentation. And really this was all in the inpatient environment. And then people started to kind of make more aggressive moves into the ambulatory space. Well, on the one hand, you could say, well, okay, so we've moved. Does that mean that we've finished over here? Well, the reality is no. We've just kind of moved from these kind of the anticipation, the sale of a new concept, the implementation, but then you have to kind of work it and grow it. And that's really kind of these optimization phases that truly are going to happen forever. But in the meantime, what's exciting, what gets talked about is what's kind of, tip of the spear, the really innovative stuff. And so now you have everybody having seemingly moved past inpatient care, ambulatory care, and now everybody's focusing on the virtual patient and the virtual experience. And now suddenly, there's a lot of interest in remote patient monitoring and artificial intelligence, and how are we going to apply that? And I think a lot of people, clinicians in particular, are left wondering, wait a second, what about the EHR? It's still not doing what I needed it to do. And it can be hard because industry is going to be chasing new money. And at the end of the day, when a lot of these things are driven by those dollars and cents, the moves to make modifications and these kind of smaller nuanced adaptations, there's not as much money in that, number one. And number two, it's often felt that it's now the domain of the health system or the practice to kind of fine tune it. So yeah, in the meantime, the attention has moved to, what's new and exciting, and lots of money is being spent there. So there's often kind of that gap. So, certainly the initial excitement over inpatient EHRs has faded, and now people are trying to kind of work in a lot of other capabilities, but it can seem like we're not done yet.
Sure. And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
I think at the end of the day, it's all about workflows and incentives. I think understanding how you work, what you want to accomplish, and then working backwards from there to figure out, okay, what are the tools that I need to make this happen? I think understanding at the very minimum, if you are a physician who's jumped into a new practice or a new health system, get to know who your resources are, whether they are colleagues or whether they are resources offered by the organization. And then certainly, find those people and buy them lunch. And if you're really into the innovation and the technology and want to meet other players, get to know your CIO, your CMIO. Vendors are often going to be stopping by, and seek out those opportunities. They really do value the input. So I think it's for us as physicians to kind of seize the day and make things work for us and for our colleagues.
Rodrigo, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Thanks again for being on the show.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.